A man buries a bag in the woods. Inside are weapons, restraints, chemicals, and cash. He covers it carefully, memorizes the location, and walks away. He will not touch that bag for 2 years. When he finally does return, he will use its contents to kill someone he has never met, in a state he has no connection to, chosen almost entirely at random. Then he will fly home, resume his ordinary life, and wait. Sometimes for months, sometimes for years. He robbed banks. He traveled to dozens of states, often on short weekend trips that looked, to anyone around him, like an unremarkable business trip or a quick visit to see family. He had a full-time construction business, a long-term relationship, and a young daughter he refused, by his own strict personal rule, to ever put in danger by targeting anyone with children of their own. For more than a decade, he left almost no pattern for investigators to follow, because he had deliberately built none. No consistent victim type, no consistent location, no consistent method beyond patience itself. He studied the killers who came before him, learned exactly what had gotten each of them caught, and built his own approach specifically to avoid every one of those mistakes. He was finally caught not because investigators cracked his method, but because of one single mistake, made under pressure, involving a stolen debit card and an ATM camera. Even after his capture, he told investigators only pieces of the truth, keeping the rest as leverage until the very end. Right up until the moment he decided he would rather die than say anything more. Today, years later, nobody still knows exactly how many people he killed. This is the story of Israel Keyes, one of the most calculated killers in American history. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. We cover real true crime cases every week. Now, let's start with who Israel Keyes actually was. Israel Keyes was born on January 7, 1978, in Richmond, Utah, and spent much of his childhood in a large, tightly controlled family that moved several times during his youth, eventually settling for a period in rural Washington state. Those who later studied his upbringing described a childhood marked by isolation, strict discipline, and a family environment that kept him largely apart from mainstream schooling and outside social influences, raised with limited exposure to the ordinary social experiences that shape most American childhoods. As a young man, Keyes enlisted in the United States Army in July of 1998, serving with the 5th Infantry Regiment of the 25th Infantry Division, based out of Fort Lewis, Washington. He completed air assault school during his service, a demanding program focused on helicopter assault operations, and was honorably discharged in July of 2001, after 3 years in uniform. Colleagues from that period would later describe him as capable and disciplined, giving no indication of the violence investigators would eventually connect him to. According to his own later statements to investigators, it was not long after leaving the military that Keyes committed his first killing. He would eventually tell investigators, almost matter-of-factly, that the transition out of structured military life left him with an unfamiliar restlessness, one that built until it became, in his own words, difficult to resist, a phrase he used repeatedly during his interviews to describe the recurring urge that would go on to define the following decade of his life. After his discharge, Keyes settled for a time in Neah Bay, a small, remote town at the northwestern tip of Washington state, home to the Makah tribe, a community historically known for its whale hunting traditions. He had met a woman from the tribe online, married her, and started a family, eventually working for the town's Parks and Recreation Department. To co-workers and neighbors, he appeared to be an ordinary, if quiet, member of the community, a description that would follow him for the rest of his life. right up until his arrest, and one that made the eventual truth about him almost impossible for anyone who knew him to reconcile. What set Israel Keyes apart from nearly every other serial killer in modern American history was not the number of people he killed, but the extraordinary discipline and planning behind how he did it. Keyes reportedly told investigators during his lengthy post-arrest interviews that he had spent years studying other notorious killers, including Ted Bundy, along with the specific investigative techniques law enforcement typically use to catch them. He used that knowledge deliberately, structuring his own crimes specifically to avoid the mistakes that had led to other killers' downfalls, treating his own crimes almost like a professional discipline to be studied, refined, and continuously improved. Rather than targeting victims who fit a consistent physical type in a consistent geographic area, Keyes selected victims almost entirely at random, often in states he had no personal connection to whatsoever, choosing people he had never seen before and would likely never have any reason to be connected to. Investigators would later note that this randomness was, in many ways, the most effective tool in his arsenal. Traditional investigative work relies heavily on finding a connection, however small, between a victim and their killer, and Keyes made sure that connection simply did not exist. He paid for almost everything in cash. He removed the battery from his cell phone while traveling to avoid leaving a digital trail that could later be used to reconstruct his movements. He rented cars under his own name for ordinary trips, then used those same trips as cover for entirely separate, unrelated crimes committed hundreds or even thousands of miles away from wherever he had told friends and family he was actually going. Perhaps most disturbing of all was his practice of burying what investigators came to call kill kits, sealed containers filled with weapons, restraints, and supplies for disposing of a body, in remote locations across multiple states, sometimes years before he ever used them. He would travel to a general region, bury a kit, and leave, giving himself no immediate reason to return and no clear evidence connecting a specific trip to a specific future crime. When the impulse to kill returned, sometimes months or years later, he would simply travel back, retrieve the kit, and select a victim in the surrounding area, treating an entirely separate, seemingly unrelated trip months or years later as the actual moment of the crime. This method meant that even after his eventual capture, investigators found themselves chasing evidence scattered across a decade and across half the country, with almost no way to know how many of these hidden caches, or how many resulting victims, might still be completely unknown, buried in locations only Keyes himself could have identified. By his own account, Israel Keyes maintained one firm personal rule throughout his entire criminal career. You would never target children, and he would never target anyone who had children of their own, a boundary he attributed directly to having a young daughter himself. It stood as a strange, almost incomprehensible point of consistency in an otherwise deliberately inconsistent pattern of violence, a limit he claimed to hold to even as he showed no hesitation whatsoever toward any of his actual victims, adults chosen simply because they happened to be in the wrong place when his internal timeline finally reached its breaking point again. Investigators who worked closely with Keyes during his months of interviews often remarked on the strange disconnect between the calm, articulate man sitting across the table from them and the crimes he was calmly describing. He rarely raised his voice. He answered questions in measured, precise language, occasionally correcting investigators' assumptions with what almost seemed like professional pride in the accuracy of his own account. That composure extended to nearly every part of his life outside the interrogation room as well. Family members, former co-workers, and even his own daughter's mother maintained in the aftermath of his arrest that they had never seen any indication of the violence he was capable of. It is this quality, more than any single crime, that continues to make his case a subject of study for investigators and researchers trying to understand how someone can maintain two entirely separate lives for over a decade without either one ever visibly bleeding into the other. Keyes told investigators that his first killing took place in the state of Washington in 2001, not long after his discharge from the Army, in the small town of Neah Bay, where he had already begun building his new life. He described the town, at the time, as isolated and uneventful, a description he offered almost as an explanation for why the urge to kill had first taken hold there. He offered investigators only limited details about this earliest crime, describing a victim selected essentially at random, without any prior relationship or connection between them. For years, investigators were unable to formally identify this victim or confirm the full circumstances of the killing, relying almost entirely on Keyes' own fragmented, carefully rationed account. Some investigators have since connected this earliest killing to a woman named Julie Ann Hansen, though even that identification has never been fully confirmed, and her remains, like those of several of Keyes' other suspected victims, have never been recovered. This pattern, a killing followed by an extended, unpredictable period of dormancy, would come to define his entire criminal career. Unlike serial killers who escalate quickly or kill in tight clusters, driven by an accelerating compulsion that eventually leads to reckless behavior and capture, Keyes appeared to operate on his own unpredictable internal timeline, sometimes going years between confirmed acts of violence, all while maintaining a completely ordinary public life in between. That patience, more than anything else, is what allowed him to operate for so long without ever drawing the kind of sustained investigative attention that eventually catches most serial offenders. In March of 2007, Keyes relocated to Anchorage, Alaska, along with his daughter, to live with a woman he had begun a relationship with. He worked as a handyman and general contractor, eventually starting his own construction business, which he named simply Keyes Construction. Over the following years, Keyes built what appeared, from the outside, to be a stable, unremarkable life. He maintained his construction business, raised his daughter, and traveled frequently, sometimes for legitimate work, sometimes to visit family members scattered across the country, and sometimes, investigators would later determine, for reasons that had nothing to do with either. Clients and business associates who worked with him during this period described him as reliable and professional, a tradesman they had no hesitation recommending to friends and neighbors. The FBI later determined that Keyes took as many as 35 separate trips between October of 2004 and his eventual capture in March of 2012, crisscrossing much of the continental United States. Investigators believe he used at least some unknown number of these trips to retrieve buried kill kits and commit additional murders, though the exact number connected to actual crimes, as opposed to entirely legitimate travel, has never been fully determined. The sheer volume of unremarkable, seemingly explainable travel meant that even his own family had no realistic way of distinguishing an ordinary trip from one that ended in violence hundreds or thousands of miles away. In June of 2011, Keyes flew from Alaska to Chicago, rented a car, and drove roughly 1,000 miles to Essex, Vermont, an area where he had buried a kill kit years earlier, waiting patiently for the right moment to return and put it to use. He spent several days in the area beforehand, quietly observing the community and searching for an opportunity, according to his own later account of the trip. There, he broke into the home of a married couple, Bill and Lorraine Currier, forcibly abducting both of them and driving them to an abandoned farmhouse nearby. According to his later confession, Keyes shot and killed Bill Currier, then sexually assaulted and strangled Lorraine Currier. He disposed of the murder weapon in a nearby reservoir, along with additional materials from his kill kit, before flying back to Alaska as though the trip had been nothing more than an ordinary visit to the region. The courier's disappearance baffled local investigators for months. There was no forced entry evidence pointing to an obvious suspect, no local person of interest with any connection to the couple, and no immediate indication that their case was linked to anything happening anywhere else in the country. Vermont, a state with a relatively low rate of violent crime, had no real precedent for a case like this, and investigators there had no reason at the time to imagine they were looking at the work of a serial killer based thousands of miles away in Alaska. It would remain entirely unsolved until KEYES' own confession, nearly a year later, finally explained what had happened to them. Their bodies have never been recovered. On February 1, 2012, Israel Keyes approached the Common Grounds espresso coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska, where an 18-year-old barista named Samantha Koenig was working alone during a quiet evening shift, closing up the small stand near the end of her hours. Keyes abducted Koenig at gunpoint. According to his later admissions, he killed her within roughly a day of taking her. In the weeks that followed, Koenig's family received a ransom demand for $41,000, accompanied by a photograph investigators later determined had been digitally manipulated to make it appear she was still alive and being held somewhere. A cruel deception designed specifically to extract money from a family desperate for any sign of hope. Desperate for any chance of getting her back, the family paid, following the instructions they had been given as precisely as they could. It was, for a killer who had spent over a decade meticulously avoiding any direct, traceable connection to his victims, an uncharacteristic and ultimately fatal misstep. Keyes began using Koenig's debit card across multiple states in the days that followed, apparently confident that scattered, small transactions in different locations would be difficult for investigators to meaningfully track, and perhaps emboldened by over a decade of successfully evading any real law enforcement scrutiny. He broke his own long-standing rule in another way as well. Unlike nearly all of his other suspected victims, Samantha Koenig lived in the same city where Keyes himself resided, blurring the careful separation he had always maintained between his ordinary daily life and his hidden crimes. It was a decision investigators would later point to as the first real crack in a criminal method that had otherwise remained almost flawless for over 10 years. FBI agents and Anchorage police, working together on Koenig's disappearance, began closely monitoring activity on her debit card, watching for any further withdrawals that might reveal the location and eventually the identity of whoever had taken her. It was, at this stage, still an active missing persons case rather than a confirmed homicide, and investigators held on to hope, however slim, that they might still find her alive. Surveillance footage from various ATMs, captured over the following weeks, showed a figure in a hood, sunglasses, and a face covering, making withdrawals in locations far from Anchorage, moving with a level of caution that made his exact identity difficult to determine from the footage alone. Investigators traced a pattern of transactions, moving steadily south and east, eventually leading them to Texas, piecing together his route almost entirely from the digital trail those withdrawals left behind. On March 13, 2012, law enforcement identified a rental car connected to the transactions and arrested Israel Keyes in Lufkin, Texas, roughly 6 weeks after Samantha Koenig's abduction. At the time of his arrest, investigators believed they were closing out a single, tragic kidnapping case. They had no idea just how much more they were about to uncover. Keyes initially denied any involvement in Koenig's disappearance. Under sustained questioning, he eventually admitted to abducting and killing her, and then, unexpectedly, began revealing far more, catching even experienced federal investigators off guard with the scope of what he began describing. Over the following months, Keyes participated in an extraordinary series of interviews with FBI agents and federal prosecutors, totaling roughly 40 hours across 7 months of contact. He confirmed responsibility for Koenig's murder and for the deaths of Bill and Lorraine Currier in Vermont. He described in general terms a broader pattern of violence stretching back over a decade, referencing trips to New York, Washington, Oregon, and Texas, and alluding to additional victims he refused to specifically name or locate, occasionally offering just enough of a detail to confirm a crime had happened somewhere, without ever providing the specifics needed to actually close the case. KEYES' cooperation was, from the very beginning, calculated and self-serving rather than a genuine confession of remorse. He offered just enough detail to demonstrate the scope of what he had done, while withholding the specific names, dates, and locations that might have allowed investigators to actually close out individual cases or provide grieving families with real answers. When pressed for more, he would sometimes simply refuse outright. In one recorded exchange, after being pushed for additional information, he reportedly pushed a notepad away from himself and asked investigators directly whether they really expected him to keep providing more. A small, telling gesture that captured just how much control he still believed he held over the conversation. Investigators came to believe KEYES viewed the information itself as a form of leverage, a way of maintaining a measure of control over his own case, even after his arrest, possibly as a means of delaying or negotiating around the eventual legal consequences he knew he was facing. Some who worked directly with him during this period described the experience as unlike any other interrogation in their careers, given how openly KEYES acknowledged the strategic nature of his own cooperation, almost treating the interviews as a kind of negotiation rather than a genuine reckoning with what he had done. News of KEYES' arrest and the sprawling scope of what he began confessing to spread quickly across national media. Unlike many high-profile serial killer cases that unfold over the course of a highly publicized trial, complete with courtroom drama stretched across months or years, the KEYES case unfolded almost entirely behind closed doors, through private interviews the public would only learn the details of well after the fact. For journalists and true crime researchers who later tried to piece together the full picture, the absence of a trial created a uniquely frustrating challenge. There was no cross-examination forcing him to clarify inconsistencies. There was no jury weighing competing versions of events. There was, instead, only the fragmented, self-interested account of a man who died before ever being forced to reconcile his own story with the physical evidence investigators continued to gather. Using the general details KEYES was willing to provide, investigators fanned out across multiple states, searching for both physical evidence and, more urgently, Samantha Koenig's remains, racing against the possibility that KEYES might simply stop cooperating at any moment. On April 2, 2012, FBI divers recovered Koenig's body from Matanuska Lake in Alaska, providing her family with the confirmation, however devastating, that they had been waiting weeks to receive. It brought a painful but necessary end to the uncertainty that had defined the case since her initial disappearance 2 months earlier. Investigators also located several of KEYES' buried kill kits based on his descriptions, including one recovered from the Deschutes River area in Oregon and another stashed in a watertight bucket in New York State, containing a firearm, ammunition, and a silencer. Each recovered kit offered a small, grim window into just how far in advance and how methodically KEYES had prepared for crimes he might not commit until years later, confirming in physical, tangible form the pattern he had already described in his interviews. Investigators have said publicly that they believe additional kits, buried in locations KEYES never disclosed, likely remain hidden somewhere across the country to this day. Israel KEYES never stood trial for any of his crimes. On December 1, 2012, while housed at the Anchorage Correctional Complex awaiting further legal proceedings, KEYES took his own life inside his cell, having concealed a razor blade that guards had failed to detect during routine searches. ending his life through self-inflicted blood loss and strangulation. He left behind a note written in his own blood, containing only 3 words: "We are one." Alongside the note, investigators later discovered a drawing, also rendered in blood, depicting 11 skulls in a single pentagram found tucked beneath his bed. The FBI would eventually conclude that the 11 skulls most likely represented the 11 murders Keyes had, over the course of his interviews, indirectly acknowledged committing, the closest thing investigators would ever get to a complete, final accounting from him directly. The FBI did not make this drawing public until 2020, nearly 8 years after his death, as part of a renewed appeal for information about his remaining unidentified victims. His death ended any possibility of a trial, and with it, any obligation on his part to ever provide the full, specific details that so many of the answers investigators still needed depended on. For prosecutors who had spent months carefully building a case against him, his suicide represented an outcome nobody had fully prepared for. A defendant who had, in his own way, controlled the terms of his case right up until its final page. During his interviews, Keyes reportedly spoke about Ted Bundy with something approaching professional admiration, studying not the violence itself, but the specific mistakes that had ultimately led to Bundy's capture decades earlier. He treated the history of American serial killers almost as a body of case studies, something to be analyzed and learned from rather than simply read about. This self-aware, almost academic approach to his own criminality set him apart from many other offenders investigators had previously encountered. Where many serial killers are eventually undone by an escalating compulsion that overrides their own caution, Keyes maintained enough discipline for over a decade to keep his violent impulses on a schedule dictated by opportunity and preparation rather than urgency. FBI Special Agent Jolene Godin, who worked directly on his case, later described his crimes as driven by a kind of deliberate hunt, comparing his mindset to someone waiting patiently for exactly the right conditions before acting. In the years since Keyes' death, the FBI has continued actively investigating the full scope of his crimes, periodically releasing new evidence to the public in hopes of identifying additional victims, treating the case as an active, ongoing investigation rather than a closed file. Only 3 of his victims have ever been formally confirmed and identified: Samantha Koenig and Bill and Lorraine Currier. Keyes himself claimed responsibility for as many as 11 murders total, spanning a period from 2001 to 2012 across Alaska, Washington, Oregon, New York, Vermont, and Texas. Investigators, drawing on the sheer number of unexplained trips he took over the preceding decade, along with unresolved missing persons cases in regions he is known to have visited, believe the true number could be significantly higher than even his own claimed total, given how selectively he chose to share information even during his most cooperative interviews. The FBI has specifically asked the public for help identifying other possible victims, releasing detailed information about Keyes' confirmed travel history, including specific dates, rental vehicles, and license plate numbers, in hopes that it might jog a memory or match an unsolved case somewhere in the country. As of the most recent public updates, several suspected victims remain entirely unidentified, existing only as fragments of description within Keyes' own limited, strategically incomplete confessions. A woman named Deborah Feldman, who disappeared in New Jersey in 2009, is among those investigators suspect may be connected to him, based partly on evidence that Keyes had researched her disappearance online prior to his own arrest. For Samantha Koenig's family, and for the Currier family in Vermont, Keyes's confession, however incomplete, at least provided a name, a rough timeline, and a place to eventually lay their loved ones to rest, or in the courier's case, a confirmed explanation even without recovered remains. That is more than many families connected to Keyes's suspected crimes have ever received. For the families of his other possible victims, families who may not even know a connection to Keyes exists, there has been no such resolution. Some may have long since assumed their missing loved ones simply left of their own accord. Others may still be actively searching, filing periodic inquiries with local police, never imagining that the answer might be tied to a name most of the country has never even heard. From a case that ended not in a courtroom, but in a locked cell in Anchorage, Alaska. Looking back at the full scope of Israel Keyes' decade-long criminal career, the reasons he evaded detection for so long become clear and deeply unsettling, offering a rare glimpse into just how far a sufficiently patient and disciplined offender can go undetected within an investigative system built largely around finding connections and patterns. He deliberately avoided any consistent pattern that investigators typically rely on to connect a series of crimes. No consistent victim profile, no consistent geographic region, no consistent method beyond patience and preparation. He separated the planning of his crimes, sometimes by years, from their execution, making it nearly impossible for investigators in any single jurisdiction to imagine that a local murder might be connected to a killer who lived thousands of miles away and had no known ties to the area. And he studied, deliberately and specifically, the very techniques law enforcement used to catch people like him, adjusting his own behavior to avoid the common mistakes that had brought down other, less careful killers, essentially building his entire criminal method around the documented failures of the offenders who came before him. It was, in the end, not a flaw in this careful system that caught him, but a single moment of impatience and recklessness, a ransom scheme and a stolen debit card, used close to home against every principle he had otherwise followed for over a decade. The very same discipline that had protected him for so long simply did not hold in the case that finally exposed him. Israel Keyes' case remains, in the words of investigators who worked it, one of the most unsettling and incomplete in modern American criminal history. Not because his guilt is in any doubt, but because so much of what he did will likely never be fully known. Unlike cases where a killer's capture brings a definitive close to years of uncertainty, Keyes' death simply transferred that uncertainty forward into a permanent, unresolved gap in the historical record. His death by suicide, just months after his arrest, permanently closed off any possibility of a full accounting. There was no trial, no jury verdict, no formal sentencing, and no obligation on his part to ever provide the specific answers that dozens of families in states across the country may still be waiting for without ever realizing it. Some of those families, statistically, are almost certainly still out there today, filing missing persons reports, checking in periodically with local police, never knowing that the answer to what happened to someone they loved may have died, deliberately withheld, inside an Alaska jail cell in December of 2012. What remains is a confirmed body count of 3, an admitted body count of 11, and an unknown true total that experts and investigators alike acknowledge may never be resolved. Somewhere across the United States, in wooded areas and riverbanks Keyes once visited on ordinary-looking trips, there may still be buried kill kits nobody has ever found, and, quite possibly, families still waiting for an answer that died with the only man who ever truly knew the whole story. It stands as a stark reminder that not every true crime case ends with closure. Some simply end, leaving behind more questions than the investigation itself was ever able to answer.